Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge podcast, where this time around we're going to be chatting about Wenvoe Castle with a little pit stop elsewhere beforehand. So we'll come to that when we get to it. My name is Paul Busby, and with me as ever is Goff Morgan. Hello, Goff.
Hello there. Hello. Greetings to you. How are you all doing? Nice to be back.
It is nice to be back. We didn't do a podcast when the great heat wave of 2 days hit us, did we? That would have been interesting.
Well, yeah, quite. That would not have been fun, because I was what we best described as a dab of lard. It was horrid. It was very horrid.
It's just as well.
Then you had your spectacular injury, and you couldn't sit at the desk because your leg was in. Well, you had 3 knees on it. That was quite amazing.
Yeah, I am little, and when my knee becomes 4 times the size of me, of course, I like to tell everyone it was a valiant sporting injury.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it at that. Yeah. And nothing to do with a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old in a race I should never have had. Never mind. Yeah. But you're okay then, are you?
Yeah, bumbling along. Getting on with life. Had to do hideous domestic chores and things, which is just I have the genes for private income, basically, and I just don't have a private income. It's very annoying.
I think there's a lot of people who could sympathize with you on that one. Okay, but when we get started now, it's Wenvoe Castle we're going to be talking about. Does that ring any bells with you, Wenvoe Castle?
I know the name, but I don't think I could point it out in a lineup of castles.
No, well, you won't be the only one with that. It looks very different today than it did when it was built in the 18th century or rebuilt in the 18th century. Anyway, it's about 6 miles from Cardiff, between Cardiff and Barry, really. But we'll get to that. We need a little pit stop first, because there has been a little bit of news recently, which was covered by the South Wales Argus this week and Wales Online last week. A country house has come up for sale, and it's this one. Machen House.
Oh, hello. Oh, interesting.
Now, Machen House is, near Lower Machen, which always makes me think of that old P.G. Wodehouse line when he was interned in the war in Upper Silesia. Yeah. And he said, if this is Upper Silesia, I dread to think what Lower Silesia will be like. As we know, the Lower Machen is a beautiful part of the...
it's a lovely place, Lower Machen.
But it's one...
church there is well worth seeing.
Yes.
Because of its collection of hatchments belonging to the Morgan family at Tredegar. Great.
And the Morgan family, it's another one of their properties in a very small area, isn't it? Because in this area, there's Machen House, there's Rupera Castle, and there's an old Elizabethan property called Plas Machen, as well as Cefn Mabley down the road, which the Morgans owned from the 1920s. So it is a Morgan-heavy area, this part of the county, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, the reason Machen House was built in the first place was as a rectory, really. You mentioned that church.
Oh, yes.
Well, here it is.
Oh, yes.
St. Michael and All Angels Church. And Sir Charles Morgan's, one of his younger sons, Augustus Morgan, became the reverend of this church. And the old rectory was fine for the old rector. It was not fine for a son of the House of Tredegar. So they basically rebuilt it entirely into a very nice little country house for the Reverend Augustus Morgan. And it's very handy, this, isn't it? Right next door to the church.
Good grief. That must be one of the best.
One of the best
in the area.
Yeah, and it was built in 1831. So it's got that Regency sort of classical look. Now, in the garden of Machen House, we have the old servants' quarters lined up against the church wall.
Oh, gosh, yes.
So it really was nicely planned out. Things have altered over the years since. The Reverend Augustus Morgan used to do his probably scintillating sermons at that church. Here it is. And you can see here, it is beautiful, and the grounds are beautiful. The grounds of Machen House were always its main feature, really, as a country house. But this isn't in the centre, this porch, as you can see. And that's because after the Tredegar estate sold it in 1956, when it became a private property, this bay here, this gable and bay here, which were the servants' areas of the house, were demolished.
Oh, I see.
Which is why the porch is a little off kilter, but I have found a little image of how it used to look.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. So yeah, there's a wing on. Yeah, I got
and that was where the servants worked. I guess things change, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, quite. Yeah. They're living entities, buildings, aren't they? They're not. Oh, I'm looking a bit rough and ready there.
Yeah, this is before 1956 because we've still got the servants' bay, and it does need a lick of paint, doesn't it?
Yeah, it needs something doing to it. It was struggling there, wasn't it?
Now we're not going to go through all the rooms in the house, but if you're interested in looking at most of the rooms in the house, you'll find them on Wales Online or the South Wales Argus website, or in fact the estate agents themselves. If you have £1.9 million burning a hole in your pocket, that's the guide in asking price at the moment. But I do remember I went to this property once. It was a Tredegar House event that the curator David Freeman held. And we had something in the gardens. I do remember this entrance hall. So there, as we're going up to the front door here,
Yeah.
Very pretty. This is a wonderful entrance hall.
Isn't that magnificent? Yeah.
And we've got the Morgan crest up there. You can see the Morgan family tree scroll.
Mm-hmm.
This is a wonderful screen. Sort of a cast iron screen here.
Yeah.
But it's the staircase, which is amazing.
Yes, look at that.
Look how delicate the joinery is here.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's really incredible.
Now, there is a big old... Now, I always thought this was just a normal newel post, they're called. It is reassuringly chunky compared to how slim and fragile the staircase looks. So it's wrapped around this chunky newel post. But I was interested to note, when I read about it, they believe that this was part of a mast from a ship.
Oh, right.
Now, this got me thinking. Because I know that Augustus Morgan, when he was 14, was a midshipman on a vessel called HMS Malta.
Yeah.
So I checked the dates, and interestingly, remember, this was built in 1831. HMS Malta, in 1831, was getting a complete refit. It was being fitted up in Plymouth as a reserve depot ship in 1831, just as this house was being built.
Oh, blimey, how interesting.
So I wonder if this isn't just a mast of any ship, but it was a mast from the Reverend Augustus's ship.
Yeah, well, yeah, that sounds interesting, doesn't it? That's an interesting theory, isn't it? And I sort of try and, I don't know if you pin that down, but it'd be a great thing to find out, wouldn't it?
It's another little knowledge podcast theory, which can never be proven.
No.
But another little piece, they've even had to go into the wall slightly to fit it all in. Yeah. So they clearly wanted to use this newel post. Yeah. So I think it had a personal benefit.
Yeah.
There it goes. It sweeps up here.
Oh, yeah.
But I think from up above, you can just see here, they've had to go into the wall to fit it all in.
Oh, yeah, exactly, yeah. Oh,
so
yeah, yes.
Interesting. So, yeah, pretty place. One thing I did want to show you is this bit, because you can see how they've designed it right from the windows with the arches and even the cupboards to make it very church-like.
Yes, yeah.
Very Gothic. Reverend Augustus Morgan. He died in 1875, the Reverend Augustus Morgan.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm showing the dining room is this fireplace is one of two fireplaces in the house to be taken from Werewolf Castle nearby.
Oh, right. Oh, interesting.
So after the fire of 1941, they obviously seem to be able to salvage at least some of the castle.
Yeah.
The grounds are brilliant.
The Reverend Augustus, when he died, was found sitting bolt upright, dead in a chair, clutching the arms tightly.
No, that wasn't Augustus, but I know who you mean. Yeah, I have to remember who that was. Yeah, we talked about that in a podcast, didn't we? Yeah. Well, no, maybe it was. No, I think you're right, Goff. I think your memory is better than mine.
Reverend Augustus, yeah, he was like...
I think you're right. I think you've got a better memory than me. I think it was the Reverend Augustus Morgan who died that way. Yeah. Yeah, his wife had died a few years beforehand, Frances Lascelles. She always wanted children. It was very sad that she never got children. There were a lot of false scares, unfortunately.
Oh,
so a terrible shame. Anyway, so here we are, beautiful grounds. And I did find something after Reverend Augustus left and after one of his relatives, Colonel Gould, took over for a bit. It was leased out as any other Tredegar estate property, you see. And they built a new rectory for the actual rector of Lower Machen. The Morgans built a new one so they could keep this fancy house for themselves. And And it is really quite funny. There was a man here called Arthur Hurd. The Reverend Darby took over. And what they used to do in Lower Machen, Arthur Hurd lived in Machen House, the Reverend Darby lived in the new rectory, and they used to hold mini Eisteddfods in Machen for years. Yeah. So poetry and dance and song and all this sort of thing. But I did think of you, Goff, because the one year when they decided, well, Reverend Darby had a nightmare this year. He put as a recital of a poem or a story which had 4 different versions. Oh. So when people started what the crowd thought were getting it wrong, they started barracking and shouting, shame, shame. And actually, they were probably just doing a different version of the poem. This is the same year, disastrous 1895 Eisteddfod of Lower Machen, which was often used in the grounds. So Mr. Hurd has let them use the grounds. He's opened it up. And I thought of you, Goff, because for this year, and I think this year alone, they had a comic verse festival added to their Eisteddfod. Oh, really? Oh, how interesting. Oh, gosh. You go back a long way with the Chilean version, don't you?
Well, yes. We've been there. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, a long time now. It's such a thing. Oh, good.
The reviews were not as good as your Chilean version. This is magnificent, so I'll read it in full. The inclusion of a comic song in the Eisteddfod programme was a daring innovation, and it is one which I trust will be allowed to have had its birth and grave at Machen. The old Eisteddfod of Taliesin is too sacred an institution to be desecrated by such rubbish as knocked 'em in the old Kent Road and get your hair cut. The Eisteddfod needs reforming, but better it die at once than be reformed on the lines of the Alhambra. It is satisfactory to know that the prize of 12 and 6 could only bring out 2 people who were bold enough to assist in the degradation of the Cymric 1,000-year-old tradition. The winner was Mr. John Rees, Tonapandi. Poor old John Rees after.
And we must presume his rendering of knock 'em in the old Kent Road must have really gone down a storm. That's
or get your hair cut.
You might have get your hair cut as well. I've never heard of get your hair cut.
Wasn't quite what they had in mind, I suppose. Anyway, after this sort of ended, and after Reverend Darby shuffled off this mortal coil, as did Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd was an interesting one, though, because he was the consul at Newport for the Republic of Costa Rica. Oh, really? An odd thing to put on your CV, Mr. Hurd of Machen House.
Yeah, good Lord.
But then someone well known to the locality in the agricultural field took over at Machen House. He lived at Rupera Castle for a while, and that was Sir Leonard Foster Stedman, the agent, the large agent of the Tredegar estate, known affectionately at Tredegar House among the servants, but never to his face as Jumbo.
Jumbo.
Because he was 6'6" in his prime. He was director of the Royal Gwent, director of Cefn Mabley Hospital, agent to the estate from 1913, captain of the Newport cricket team for 7 seasons, and captain of the Monmouthshire Cricket Club for 17 seasons. So he moved into Machen House. And here we see Foster Stedman at one of Lord Tredegar's house parties.
Oh, yeah.
So there's Foster Stedman, and you've got Lord Tredegar here. Oh, Frank is nibbling at him. Frank is the dog. And just for you, Goff, really, this character over here, who I once played in a murder mystery, later became Lord Tredegar's brother-in-law. This is Count Ilarion Vorontsov Dashkov, better known as Larry.
Larry. Oh, right.
His sister, Princess Olga Dolgoruki, possibly given a polite nudge by Larry, ended up becoming Viscountess Tredegar in 1939. So there they all are. Mrs. Shipley, Evan Tredegar is there. Now, Peter Thornycroft, who some either politics aficionados or people with a long memory, or the older of our listeners will know, became Lord Thornycroft and was at one time the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He'd lost his seat in 1945 for Stafford, and he came to fight a by-election that year for Monmouth, which he won, and was MP for Monmouth for about 20 years after that. But he didn't have anywhere to stay. So he started off staying with this chap here, Lord Tredegar, Evan Morgan, at Tredegar House. And he thought that was very fine. But is it fair to say, Gough, that this particular Lord Tredegar had a reputation at that time?
Oh, yeah. Well, he had many reputations. I know which one you are particularly referring to.
I'm not sure either.
He was a scandalous figure in many cases. He was he had a reputation of flirting with the far right. He had connections with military intelligence. He was a very, very out gay man at the point when you could probably be when you would be in prison for it. But he basically got away with it because of deference and because of his position. He was a sort of occultist, very, 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 very informed and very high-ranking occultist in Britain and across Europe. Papal Chamberlain, as well as being an occultist. Referred to at one point as being Grand Master of the Black Mass in Paris. He got around a bit. He got around a bit.
So it's fair, and we will talk about Evan Tredegar at some point in the future. It's a long one, that will be.
Yeah.
But anyway, Peter and his wife Sheila Thornycroft didn't realise, knew Evan, but stayed happily at Tredegar House while fighting the by-election until the local Conservative Association told Peter Thornycroft, if you stay at that house with that man, it will lose you votes in the constituency. It has to be said that was quite a cheek coming from the local Conservative Association, whose president at the time was that man.
Oh, God.
But anyway, they left Tredegar House, and Evan gave them Machen House.
Yeah.
So Peter and Sheila Thornycroft moved into Machen House, and according to Sheila Thornycroft, it took 4 land girls to clear the gardens.
Oh, yeah.
They did, however, get their own bridge.
Oh, right. Look at that.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
If only for 1.9 million tucked in the back pocket.
Yeah.
That would be handy. So they are beautiful Machen House up for sale now with a wonderful history, really. Like I said, it became privately owned in 1956 when the Tredegar estate sold most of what was left of their land. It tells you something. Foster Stedman, by the way, moved from Machen House. And he moved to a place called the Garth, not far from Baselig, which became the Friendly Fox pub.
Oh, right. Oh, gosh.
Foster Stedman was also knighted. And you know that the Tredegar estate's a grand one when the agent of the estate is a knight.
Yeah. Yeah, quite.
So it really was quite one. But anyway, we're going to move away from Machen House. And we are going to move towards now Wenvoe Castle.
Aha.
Dear old... Now, Wenvoe, we need to get up our usual map, don't we?
Yeah.
So here is Wenvoe Castle. Here is a place that you'll be talking about, I think, a little bit later on, Gough. Bearswood.
Bearswood.
And you'll be pleased to know, if we do our usual thing, that although there's not much left of Wenvoe Castle, Bearswood is complete.
Oh, yeah.
So it's still there in all its glory. If anything, with a few more trees.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's actually expanded to the north of it. The outline. You put the castle back on again.
The old castle.
Yeah, because the sort of shape of the castle seems to be preserved. Yeah, look at that. That baseline shape of the castle is still very much there.
I'm afraid not.
No. If you go back to the other one.
Yeah.
And you'll see that there's a line there in the area. There, look, that line is very, very similar to the actual.
Oh, the line. I see what you mean about the actual line. Yeah, this is the stable block here, but the castle that used to stretch all down there is gone. But yeah.
Car park. But the sort of the delineation of it on the side is pretty much there.
I see what you mean. And it's now a golf club.
Yeah.
The third of our properties to become a golf club, I think we've talked about after Saint-Pierre, which is now Saint-Pierre Marriott Hotel and Golf Club, and the Hendra, of course, and now Wenvoe Castle. I mean, if it does get turned into a golf club, it does tend, it alters the landscape, but it does tend to preserve it a bit, doesn't it?
Yes.
You're not going to have houses on it anytime soon.
No.
Anyway, but there it is, Wenvoe Castle. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about Wenvoe. There aren't actually that many images because there was an old castle there, but probably not on this site.
Oh, right.
Probably to the north of it. Now, we know way back in early medieval times, it was owned by three families, de Sully, Le Fleming, and Malafont. So Welsh, obviously.
Obviously.
By the time of Henry VIII, John Leyland, who traipsed around all over the place, the king's librarian and antiquarian, wrote, "Sad times for Wenvoe Castle. All the buildings of this Wenno, standing on a little hill, is down, save in one tower and broken walls." So not much left at that point. The Herbert family ended up owning it because they're the Herbert family. They usually end up owning everything.
Yeah.
And in 1594, we hear that the castle and ditches of Wenvoe were leased by Edmund Thomas, who built a house before he died in 1638. Better than trying to build it after you died, I suppose.
Yeah.
And what we've got from here on in, the Thomas family, baronets of Wenvoe, ran the place. They were local worthies, really, and they did pretty well for themselves. I mean, at one point, they were lawyers, they had a meteoric rise, and by 1638, Edmund Thomas owned 200 houses, 100 barns, 200 gardens, 100 orchards, and an estate of 3,630 acres, making $2,500 a year. That's not bad, is it?
Oh, pretty cool.
In fact, $2,500 a year at that time would put them only behind in Glamorgan, Lewis of the Van, Mansell of Margan, and old Sir Edward Stradlin of St. Donat. So the Thomas family are in that sort of field.
Top money bracket then.
They also owned Rupera Castle for a while.
Oh.
Before selling it in 1706 to John Morgan the merchant.
Yeah.
And they were also known as fighters and dancers. I don't know.
And dancers.
Yeah.
Interesting combination.
Well, Muhammad Ali managed it.
Well, the Spartans were pretty nippy, I'm led to believe, as well. They used to do a dance practice, so they all moved in synchronicity on the battlefield, apparently.
Uh-huh. Oh, very good. Well, there are old rhymes apparently surviving, referring slightly obliquely to the dancers of Wenvoe. So it might be from these Thomases. So you have all these baronets who become MPs for Glamorgan. The one that started spending all the money was Sir Edmund Thomas, the third baronet, who was groomed to Frederick, Prince of Wales in the 1750s, and the Surveyor General of the Woods north and south of the Trent in the 1760s. But what ruined this bloke was two passions which were very expensive at the time. I don't recommend them. Politics and landscape gardening.
Yeah. The two big drains on any income in the period. Yeah.
Yeah. It said he had much delight in cleaning the land about his palace, in planting clumps of fir, in changing lanes and pulling down houses and building some.
Yeah.
The result of all this, though, was someone said, Wenvoe is not at all worth seeing.
Oh dear.
And nearly 100 years after it was worth £2,500 a year, it's now worth £1,243 a year. And was put up for sale in 1769.
Yeah, not a great home improvement scheme, that one, really, was it?
Not really. The Thomases sort of danced out of the area at this point. So they're still going, though. They didn't live at Wenvoe, but they're still known. The baronetcy is still known as Thomas of Wenvoe, even though they never lived there since the 4th baronet. We're currently on to the 12th baronet, Sir David Thomas. 12th baronet of Wenvoe.
Yeah.
So he's still going. So when they're selling this castle, this house, really, that somehow still is called a castle, and it appears to be a rambling, but nobody bothered to make a sketch of it.
Whatever.
Nothing that survived.
Oh, good Lord. But he said it wasn't worth looking at. So perhaps he thought, no, I'm not wasting the pencil.
No. It offended the senses. No. Anyway.
It was so unattractive, nobody even wanted to draw it.
No. We're going to go with that. And actually, when the next chap took over, he immediately knocked it down. And we have a little image of this bloke, but quite frankly, it could have been anyone, Goff. I don't know why I bothered. There he is.
Oh yeah.
This shadowy character was Mr. Peter Birt, who had made his money. He's from Berkshire, but he made his money in Yorkshire, being very clever. He had a 14-year lease on the tolls of the Aire and Calder navigation. Now, the navigation is privately managed waterway in Yorkshire. It's one of the first river navigation schemes, basically.
Oh, right.
And Peter Birt, as it often happens if you get in on the ground level of new ideas, you can make an absolute fortune. And he was known as unpopular but efficient, was Peter Birt. And he made a fortune. He somehow managed to cut a deal whereby even when he left the company, he and his family were entitled to a 10% share of the navigation profits for 50 years.
Blimey.
However, he decided to retire away from Yorkshire. So you do wonder if he's taken his money and run basically to a place where he isn't known. And he decides to buy Wenvoe Castle. And he spends £41,000 buying Wenvoe Castle in 1774, and he immediately knocks it down. Now, before we get on to what Mr. Birt did at Wenvoe Castle, the area he was coming into is an area he wouldn't have known. And he wouldn't have known about legends and rumors. And so what sort of, we love folklore here as well and legends. So what sort of stories, do you have any that Mr. Peter Birt might have learned?
Well, settle down, everybody. That's all you could say.
We'll settle at Goth's feet. And
this is an interesting moment. I got something to think. So I've been looking into the back of things, these type of stories. But I would like to introduce you to probably what Mr. Birt was frighteningly familiar with, the Witch of Wenvoe.
Ooh.
So basically, it's a folklore. This was recorded in Folklore and Folk Stories of Wales by Mary Trevelyan in 1909. Now, isn't that interesting as well? Because we've come across an awful lot of folkloric interest around the turn of the 20th century in the big families that we've come across in the big houses. There's generally somebody out there collecting stories together, you know, and I find that, and that's a very interesting little thing. Of the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, they're starting to record these folk tales. So this is the folk tale of the Witch of Wenvoe, and it says that basically between Cadoxton, Juxtabarry, and Wenvoe, they were credited with having werewolves. And it said a man born in the early 19th century remembered hearing his father talking about the Witch of Wenvoe having a spite against a young man who once proposed marriage to her niece and then jilted her. So he basically jilts the witch's niece, and he goes off and then he marries somebody else. And he's living near Bears Wood at the time. So a year or so after he's jilted his sweetheart and married another, the witch twists her girdle. Now, this is an interesting little one. Twists her girdle and lays it on the threshold of the new bride's house. And as the married couple step in over it into the house, I like to think he was carrying her at the time.
Oh, yeah.
As they step into the house, to everybody's surprise, it says, the bridegroom was turned instantly into a werewolf. Now, that would put the damper on many receptions, I would imagine. So he rushed away into the Bear's Wood, and the poor old bride was left disconsolate. Every night the werewolf ran howling around the witch's house to the terror of his former sweetheart. She was so shocked by the incident that she pined away and died in less than a year. And then the Witch of Wenvoe, who for some reason decided that she still wanted this guy to marry her niece, threw a charmed lambskin over the werewolf, and he returned to human shape. So later on, he's married her niece, but not surprisingly, it was not necessarily a marriage made in heaven. He behaved incredibly badly to her. So the Witch of Wenvoe cursed him again.
Oh, dear. He just thought he'd learned his lesson.
Again, well, he didn't. Turned his back into a werewolf again. He obviously runs off into the woods. But in the interim, the witch dies, and that's it. After her death, no charm could restore him to human shape, and he was condemned to live as a werewolf to the day of his death, about 9 years later, when it says he was accidentally shot in the woods. So they weren't exactly hunting down a werewolf. They sort of went, "What's that? Bang! Oh, bugger! I've killed a werewolf." But it was, yeah. But it's some interesting little things, because he was also referred to. Yeah, some sort of saying that the werewolf was killed in Bears Wood, which we saw as part of Wenvoe Castle grounds, and is still pretty much intact. But other people were said referring to him as the Wild Man of the Woods. No, we've met the wild man of the woods before. We'll come back to that. So this is, I got a couple of nice little images for you here. If I could put the get the screen share on, we can see where we are. There we go. This is your typical woodcut of a werewolf in the period, looking slightly embarrassed in his underpants, which I think is quite nice.
Oh, he is, isn't he?
You've been turned in a wolf, but at least you kept your pants on, a little bit of human dignity. It's quite, werewolf legends are much more than we think them to be. Yeah, it's been slightly unpleasant.
Oh dear.
To obviously, I think probably the jilted bride. And of course, the werewolves always meet their tragic end. This is French, as you can see. This is La Mort de la Loup-garou. The loup-garou is the French for the French werewolf, also Canadian as well. But of course, he was referred to again in these stories. Some of the local people thought him as the wild man of the woods. I mean, back with him. Here he is. We came up with the conversations when we were discussing the origins of the Green Man recently. It was popularized by Lady, got out my head, Lady Raglan, who popularized the concept of the werewolf. Now, why go babbling on about werewolf stories? Now, it's quite interesting because this story has lots and lots of different echoes, basically, of what's going on. Because a lot of folklore stories aren't just, literally about a witch that lived in the woods. It might have been attached to a story, but there's stories that have long precedence. So this story was being told by somebody, who remembered it going back. So he talks about in the early 19th century, somebody remembered it, and then you go back. So you're looking at 17th, 16th century, possibly anyway. But if you go further back, you realize that there are lots of interesting traditions about goddesses and gods and goddesses. So one of the early goddesses, Celtic goddess I came across, is the goddess Bridget. If I reel it up here. Oh, lives in the picture, I beg your pardon. Bridget. Now, Bridget is a pan-Celtic deity who is also the goddess of healing. And more importantly, she had a healing girdle.
Ah, the girdle.
Girdle. Now, these healing girdles, these healing belts, crop up a great deal in these types of stories. So it's interesting when the witch of Wenvoe curses the man, she takes off the girdle, the belt, and twists it. In other words, bends it out of shape. In other words, you're going to change the shape of something. So that is an echo of a form of sympathetic magic, but possibly even goes back into this. Now, Bridget is rather interesting because she was worshipped particularly here by the Brigantia. And as you know, the Brigantia is one of the root names for Britain. And one of the other names for Bridget is Britannia. So Britannia is actually still on the coins. There she is. Got it in. But she also becomes turned into a Christian saint by the Celtic Church and becomes Saint Bridget. So the stories, because Bridget was such a popular figure, they couldn't eradicate belief in her. So they basically converted her, made her a Catholic saint instead. And she also, she becomes one of the first nuns. She was basically, she was very, very lovely. And she decided that she was too lovely, so she pulled her eye out to make herself less attractive, at which point her parents said, don't do that, Bridget. So she put it back in and healed it. Because again, she had miraculous healing powers. Also, what is in point is that Bridget gave her famous healing girdle to a beggar who was able to make a living from it as a healer thereafter. Saint Bridget is also Saint Bride's. And Saint Bride's, as you know, Saint Bride is a major area around Newport area, St. Bride's. So this tradition goes way back even more. You can possibly even track her back to the Greek goddess Hecate. Now, a lot of people, when they were collecting folklore stories, these are people educated in the classics, so they like to see root traditions as well into other things. Hecate is a name that crops up an awful lot in association with witches, because she was believed to be the goddess of magic. But also had a belt which contained the keys to the other world and the access to magic. And it says here she was venerated as a mother goddess, much like the Celtic hearth goddess, Bridget. So this goes way, you know, we're talking of a story that traditions of which possibly go way back, more than you're getting into sort of, you know, the idea obsession with witchcraft, which occurred, well, for centuries in Britain and across Europe. But the other interesting thing, everybody knows about the witch trials, which were endemic across Europe for a very, very long time, peaking and rising at certain periods. Obviously, when James I comes to the throne, witch trials take off because he was an obsessive obsessed with witchcraft and a principal demonologist. But there is an association with witches which I have never come across before, and that is werewolves. In the same time as there were witch trials going on, there were werewolf trials going on across a lot of Europe, and the associated with the werewolves were generally believed to be men who had been turned into wolves by witches to perform their bidding. But also witches, so werewolves themselves were arrested, tried. Here's a very gruesome illustration of two witches being burned with a werewolf in the middle. But this went on for centuries, particularly because, Germany, Europe, various things, Germany, France, Burgundy period, very, very densely forested areas, basically, that were prey to wolves anyway. But many believed, again, witches turning men into werewolves as sort of familiars. Now, this was right at the top. I mean, in 1521, inquisitors were appointed by the Pope, who presided over several trials of alleged werewolfery. A lot of the werewolf trials have the same sort of things. And it says subsequent werewolf trials often featured similar details: men in black, a magic salve, and belts or skins that turned the accused into wolves. So this idea, the Witch of Wenvoe's story, as well as be a fascinating little bit of folklore, actually has precedence in stories which are much more widespread, much more longer in tradition. The ideas of a lot of, you also get with the Brigitte and goddesses and things like that, is they were also possibly sort of transferred in what are called cunning folk. And the cunning folk were, women who were midwives, herbal healers, all these various things. And they were operated under what was considered white magic at the time, beneficial magic. It was still classed as magic, but it was so tolerated because it actually did some good. In fact, if you went to your local herbalist, you probably had a better chance of surviving than going to some of the doctors in the period, who were also equally, if you could, for one of your local doctors and very educated university men, were quite capable of prescribing bewitchment if they couldn't diagnose the actual cause of anything else. Yeah. So again, it's a fascinatingly complex period. So it's possible that these echoes of healing powers of witches also, they were there. If you could heal, you can also curse. You can do both. That gets transferred into some of these sort of witch stories which come from, and all these little threads go right the way through up until you're looking at the early 19th century and echoes of these previous stories. Yeah. So werewolves and witches have a major association, and it is interesting to think that at the same time as women were being persecuted for witchcraft, men were being persecuted as werewolves. Now that's something that is not really known. We don't know that.
But do you think they've had a historic story to latch onto? Because we haven't had the Witch of Hensel Castle, we haven't had the Werewolf of the Gare, but we have it in Wenvoe. So I wonder if maybe there was a story about a man who did end up living in the woods and he was a troubled character.
Always possible. I mean, those things are possible. Yeah, the wild man of the woods, as he was referred to. It may be someone who did live in the woods, did indigenously. But the connection with the witches and the healing girdles and this bit, I think possibly does relate to Saint Bride, who is a figure within our area, within South Wales. And because she was also capable of cursing as well. Okay. And healing. So I think it probably is. Again, they've mashed the stories together and they've got all merged into one thing. It's interesting, though. I mean, this to these types of tales, and it's that thread of the girdle, particularly the belt, the healing belt, the mat you twist it, it curses you, the other things it say. It's fascinating. It's interesting. There's another thing.
certain areas tend to attract these sorts of stories anyway. And we'll move on. I'm aware we haven't actually got to Wenvoe Castle yet. That was my fault with the Machen House. But it is interesting. I did read something where someone said very matter-of-factly, "Oh, I followed one of the little people into Wenvoe Castle grounds." It was an 18th century, so the little people were around as well. Interesting.
Oh, well, that's weird. Yeah, that's with the goblin games at Mardy Farm. Yeah,
Goblin games at Mardy Farm.
Belief in these figures is still very, very prevalent, right up to the turn of the 19th century.
Fascinating.
I find it. You might be saying, "What the hell is this? You know, this is not history." Well, it is history.
Well, it is.
These are historical documents that tell you the way people thought about the world that they lived in.
Absolutely.
And I think that's very, very important. I think it is important to see these long, threads of tradition, which comparatively recently have disappeared. I mean, really comparatively recently. We're not talking about, things that have gone centuries ago. But in fact, in terms of magical practice, a lot of magical practice still takes place.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think these kinds of stories make a community, especially back then. They all would have known about this in the Wenvoe Arms, wouldn't they, when Peter Birt rolled up from Yorkshire?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what the basis for it would be. But maybe we can talk a lot more about that. We've got to do some version of a Halloween show this year, because there's so much that we've had to leave out, isn't there?
Yeah. I think what we'll collect all the other stories together and have an anthology night.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Birt has dodged the no werewolves when Birt turns up, 1774, but he immediately demolishes this house, obviously, that no one seemed to like, and he got 2 people to build a new one. And those people are, well, one of them at least is a name to conjure with, Robert Adam, of all people, a famous architect, and a local Cardiff boy called Thomas Roberts. And you get the idea, actually, that... well, I don't know how much Robert Adam actually did. There's one document which suggests he'll do the staterooms, but he'll leave all the other more functional stuff, the servant stuff, to Mr. Roberts of Cardiff,
Yes, yeah.
But they had to blow up the old house with gunpowder, which makes me wonder, did they use any of the fabric of the old castle nearby to build the so-called Wenvoe Castle Mark II? Because, it must have been substantial that you needed gunpowder to blow it up.
Well, quite, yeah.
The problem they did have was building this new house, which was rather grand. It was in blue stone, and it was described as being a charming effort of bad taste on Mr. Birt's. Again, very unfair. And they were up against it. We're not sure how much work Adam was actually doing.
Yeah, quite, yeah.
But we do know they tried to get timber, for instance, from Fonmont Castle, another one of our podcasts, from Mr. Robert Jones. And someone complains Mr. Jones's timber is so very crooked. I can hardly find a good ground stick among the lot. They had problems. They had problems building this thing.
Yeah.
But they did manage to build it. And our first view of it is actually by J.M.W. Turner in his sketchbook. So you can barely see this. So I will go on to a better.
Yeah.
Somewhere here is Mr. Birt's new castle.
Oh, yeah, yes. Oh, that's slightly better. Oh, blimey.
Quite big. In fact, very big, because the front stretches for about 375 feet. Now, we have seen like Piercefield, a central 18th century block and pavilions. Yeah. But what we've got here is hard to see. I hadn't really seen much. We've got little mini pavilions halfway along.
Yeah.
Which you've never really seen before.
No.
So this is the new Wenvoe Castle. It is. Hopefully Birt was happy with it. He didn't stay there particularly long. When he died, and his daughter Anne married a man called Robert Jenner. And the Jenner family took over from that era. Jenner is a name to conjure with in Barry. The football ground is Jenner Park, for instance. The Jenner family ended up owning Barry Island.
Oh, right.
And they got involved in... So,
yeah.
Jenner family name to conjure with. That's a better view, isn't it?
Yeah.
So here you can see.
Oh yeah, the little middle pavilions are sort of swallowed by ivy. You can't really see them at the moment.
Do you know what? There are very few. In fact, I only know of 2. This is how ridiculous it is. 2 internal photographs of Wenvoe Castle.
Oh, God.
So anyone out there, if you're a Thomas baronet that might somewhere have, what's his name? Sir David. Sir David, if you have got any images of the old Wenvoe Castle, the Thomas house somewhere, let us know, because history has forgotten it. And if anyone has got, maybe you worked in service there, maybe you're related to the Jenners, any images of inside Wenvoe Castle, we'd be very happy to show those, wouldn't we, Goff?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Now, when one of the Jenners died, when we get to 1870, we've reached that stage. The Jenners are involved in railways at this point. They're making plenty of money. A good old-fashioned neighborhood rumor went round. And the good old-fashioned neighborhood rumor said that this man here, Emperor Napoleon III,
oh, yeah,
was desirous of becoming the owner of Wenvoe Castle and the estate which surrounds it. If he purchases the property, he will, of course, become the Lord of Barry Island and monarch of all he surveys. We have to make sure in the Bristol Channel there are at least 2 warships to make sure that Barry Island does not become an Elba Mark II. Isn't that really? How did these rumors start? In the end, though, Napoleon III did end up in Kent, I think, at Chislehurst. So he did spend the last few days. He's buried in Hampshire. So why not Wenvoe Castle? Yeah, his son actually fought and was killed in the Zulu War. He badgered the British to let him, and he died, and he's buried there as well. So imagine that, Napoleon III, Lord of Barry Island. Might have happened.
That would have been, that's a what if to conjure with, isn't it?
That's a magnificent what if. Robert Francis Jenner, however, married an Elizabeth Lascelles. Again, Lascelles is a name that's already been mentioned. They get everywhere. And their daughter Emma wrote, "My dear mother always thought the year wasted if there was not a new baby born." One of the babies was the heir. And so the babies came. First, there was Robert Francis, then Alfred, then Emma, then Hugh, then Francis, then Edmund, then Gertrude, then Adolphus. They're running out of names now. Then Frederick, then Henry, then Herbert, then Harriet, then Algernon, then Isabel, and finally Bruce.
Yeah, but Bruce hasn't worked quite so well as a name, has it? So how many were there?
There were 15 that lived to adulthood, pretty much.
That lived to adulthood, so there were some...
Probably others that died in infancy. Poor old Elizabeth died in her 40s, utterly worn out, I should imagine.
Christ.
So there is no question.
Pregnant.
There is no question of the Jenner family dying out anytime soon with all those cadet branches going. So this is the man, the eldest, Robert Francis Lascelles Jenner, who took over. He seems a nice enough chap, well liked in Wenvoe. He would sort of turn up. If anyone was ill on the estate, he'd turn up with a bunch of grapes in person, which was quite nice of him.
Oh, yeah.
And he was very much involved in getting a railway. He wanted a railway to Barry Island. He wanted it, that sort of thing going on there. But with all those kids, I hope they had a decent nanny, quite frankly. Otherwise, it would be extraordinary. But was he so nice? Or did he ultimately rob his sister from her inheritance? Probably not, actually. But we'll go and have a little look. First of all, another little look at Wenvoe Castle with sheep around it. There's a great story, actually, of when the Reverend Price, you know the Reverend Price who sometimes gets talked about with the Chartists?
Oh, yeah, brilliant.
The Reverend Price with cremation and all of that, very much a radical. He turned up to old Captain Jenner and he said, "Could 2 of my sheep stay at Wenvoe Castle for a little while?" And the Captain Jenner said, "Well, yes, of course." Next day, he turns up with this herd of sheep. They sort of invade the castle, eating everything they possibly can. Reverend Price. But the key Jenner is actually this chap's sister, Gertrude, one of the 15. Gertrude Jenner. Fascinating character. And let's have a little look at her. There she is.
Oh, yeah.
Gertrude Jenner. She was the most active suffragist in the 1870s and 1880s in South Wales.
Oh, gosh, interesting.
She got involved in all kinds of things. You'd often find her collecting tin outside Cardiff Market. And because she was a spinster of a certain age, And because she dressed in this sort of fashion, she was easy for satirists to make fun of.
Yeah.
You know, the punch-style satirists. And she was extremely eccentric. But she did a lot of good work. She was involved in the prevention of cruelty to animals, and she always tried to get women off the death penalty.
Oh,
she would lobby the Home Secretary, and apparently she helped save the lives of 14 women who had been sentenced to death, including the Whitchurch murderer, and all of these murders in the area linked often infanticide, where the woman, you know, has lost her mind or something like that. But if there's a woman who's sentenced to death, Gertrude Jenner would often turn up, sometimes in court, where she'd sit there to be with her sisters, as she called the convicted women. She was also very much into temperance, to a scale that, well, I think it's because essentially she was into temperance. Let me have a little look, first of all. I've looked her up on the census. She lived alone in a place called Tea Picker in Wenvoe village. If you find her in the 1881 census, she's down here. Tea picker, Gertrude Jenner, 46, and as occupation, an honest working woman.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
She always tried to make sure that the children had toys for Christmas when she had money. It wasn't long before she couldn't. She complained that police cells were too cold in winter. She campaigned on that.
Yeah.
And she said that the problem with Britain was a want of Christ-like reality.
Oh, how interesting.
Very religious, very royalist. She insisted, even when her money was low, on sending presents to Princess Beatrice and things like this. And she would always turn up. But you can imagine this, dressed almost, somebody said dressed like a gypsy with a large bag. She became very well known, living at her little house, Tea Picker, in Wenvoe village. Became very well known. Although we've got cartoons of her, I think I might have found her as well.
Oh, right. The Cottage Wenvoe.
The Cottage Wenvoe. I know that in 1873, or was it 1876, one of those ages, one of those years, she changed the name of her cottage from The Cottage to Tea Picker.
Oh, right.
So if this is before 1876, and it might be, this might be the only surviving image of Gertrude Jenner.
Oh, interesting.
So we might
have you noted the crutch there?
Yeah.
That's interesting because in the cartoon, she's using a stick.
Yeah, she was always wounded because quite often she was often assaulted, quite frankly. She was very unlucky. She was sitting under a tree in the nearby church, I think St. Mary's, I think in Wenvoe, and a drunk men would go towards her as if, you know, just to make fun of her, you see.
Oh, gosh.
She's the local eccentric. I mean, I'll tell you why this could be a problem. If I can stop this share and we have a little look at Wenvoe and Tea Picker, which is still here. But for that, we need to go here. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So if we go forward, we're in Wenvoe. This is Tea Picker. This was the cottage of Gertrude Jenner. And if we just go along here, you've got her back gate here. At one time, someone came through the back gate and started abusing her in the kitchen, insulting her. But of course, she's right next door to the pub.
The Wenvoe Arms, yeah.
And she was always trying to get them to lose their license, the license renewal.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you can't blame the woman for having, she had 11 panes of glass smashed one time at Tea Picker.
Gosh.
And you might wonder, you might be saying, well, clearly she's a rich woman. But she's not. She's living on her own. Did you notice in the census?
Yes.
No servants.
No.
She's living on her own at Tea Picker. And this is because she was convinced that her father's will was wrong. She was convinced that she should have had more from the Wenvoe Castle estate when he died. And she kept fighting for this for years and years and years. She was always in court. To the point that, quite frankly, it became embarrassing. She took the same case to court 19 times.
Oh, gosh.
She fell out with her brother's... let me get that back. She fell out with her brother's widow, Laura Jenner, who lived at the castle. And she was convinced that she was being robbed out of her estate. So you have these two women in Wenvoe in the 1880s, 1890s. Laura Jenner, who lives at Wenvoe Castle, and her sister-in-law, Gertrude Jenner, who lives at Tea Picker, and they are at war, basically. And this relationship sort of coloured village life at the time. But things used to happen to her. She would walk, always in the newspapers, she walked into a shop once and collapsed. And all the newspapers said, bomb scare, bomb scare. It wasn't a bomb scare, there was a package of ammonia. And she picked it up and collapsed rather dramatically because of the smell. She was rather dramatic, Gertrude Jenner.
Yeah.
To wind up Laura, her sister-in-law, she used to pick roses and pick flowers in the grounds of Wenvoe Castle, which she knew she was banned from because of all the trouble she was causing. And she went in there, and the gardener came and told her to go away and tried to wrench, the flowers out of her hand. At this point, she screamed, "Murder!" and took him to court, always in court. Yeah. And the problem was she always took the case herself.
Oh, gosh.
Now, there's this account praising her as the feminist she was and all that work. But, sometimes when you turn someone into a saint, and actually there are amusing bits and really tiresome bits in their character, Gertrude Jenner is one of those people. Because it says she used to bamboozle the legal brains. She used to go there and lay out all her paperwork and bamboozle them. She didn't bamboozle them, she confused them. She was always in court, always with these extraordinary cases, and she would always then try and twist the case to, why haven't I got Wenvoe Castle? My father's will, blah, blah, blah. And then she got into her head that actually it was her brother to blame, and there was a forged document, and actually she now needed £100,000. But sadly, she'd become a complete joke in legal circles. She didn't know what she was doing legally. She became such a joke with this that there was a theatre in London who offered her 200 guineas to show scenes of litigation, scenes of Gertrude Jenner's cases. And we could go through them if they had time. They're very amusing to read through. Yeah. And she lost practically all her money, really.
Oh, no, that's a shame.
It was like Wenvoe Castle estate was the great white whale.
Yeah.
And she nearly lost all her money. She was still trying to help people, but 19 times before the court. Forged signatures, In the end, Lord Bute paid for Tea Picker to be mended, which was nice. And she said, oh, this is the first time in 18 years where I know this winter I will not have a leaky roof.
Oh, yeah.
So she's an interesting character.
Yeah.
Although she would tend to sort of push her books on you. You ever met anyone who pushes their books on you, Goff?
Many.
But in the middle of a court case? In the middle of one court case, she thrust the book that she'd written called Homely Thoughts on the Agricultural Depression, even though it had nothing to do with the case that was going on. But that was Gertrude. A fascinating character, I think probably needs to be looked into more.
Yes, yeah.
But she didn't help us. I mean, at times, if anything was built on land she thought was hers, she'd destroy it, destroyed a stile. There was a wall built around a well. She destroyed that as well. So you can see the problems in the village, can't you?
Yeah, quite, yeah.
But she died in 1904. She never did get any of the Wenvoe Castle estate because, quite brutally, she probably wasn't entitled to it. There probably wasn't a forgery.
Yeah.
And it was all very sad. But she did a lot. 14 women saved at least.
Yeah.
Interesting character. And there she's buried, Gertrude, with Isabel, the youngest daughter, and a few of the others at St. Mary's Church. There's another little one of Wenvoe.
Oh, that's nice.
It's quite nice. Laura carried on living there, probably slightly more peaceful after her sister-in-law Gertrude died in 1904. So she was a widow for a long time, was Laura. It's very interesting. There's because Gertrude Jenner left such an impact, years later, any story involving an eccentric woman, they put down to Gertrude Jenner, even though she'd been dead for years.
Yeah.
Very unfair.
Yeah, well, we talk about how legends and stories grow, and that's how you attach stories to known figures and you attach things to other things, and that's how it's part of the Richard Wenvoe stories in a way, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, when Laura died in 1910, there was a cataclysmic fire at Wenvoe Castle.
Oh.
And it destroyed the library. Smoke went through the entire building. But the East Wing in particular, although externally it stayed intact, they lost the library. Laura managed to get to safety. Nobody was hurt, but there was terrible fire. Now, I thought that was it. From 1910 fire, that was it. But it wasn't. Laura continued living in there until 1926, which I didn't realize.
Oh.
But when she dies, it is, of course, time to put the castle up for sale. And so yeah, again, it's shooting land. They're saying vacant possession and all of this sort of thing.
I don't know if they said that bothy and married quarters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Two very separate things.
Yeah.
So I improved this. I know it's really just saying what we've just said. Wenvoe Castle for sale. But I like this. MP to marry in the crypt.
Yeah, nothing to do with anything, but we like it.
No, but I know Mr. Brocklebank, I think, was MP for Nottingham or something. I know it's the crypt chapel of the House of Commons, but I love the fact that poor Miss Wise is actually marrying the crypt keeper. I don't know how the marriage went. I hope they were happy. Nobody wanted to buy Wenvoe Castle.
Oh.
At one point, you could have got it for £4,000.
Oh, good Lord.
Which came with, probably a lot of that land as well, but nobody wanted it. So if nobody wants to buy this huge thing, what do you do?
I mean,
well,
if you look at the picture, you can see the windows are out of that wing there.
Yeah,
So
you're quite right.
You've got one half of a building with the derelict burnt out wing on it as well.
Quite right. So it's to be sold for demolition.
Oh, God.
And that's what they did. This was 1930. Eventually, it was sold. And here's a little image where you can just about see they've taken off the roof already.
Yeah.
You got a mound of something. Happened to so many of the properties that we've talked about, over the years. And like I said, we've only got 2 photos that I know of inside Wenvoe Castle, and they're here.
Oh, right.
The walls were sort of light blue.
Yeah.
With white surrounds. And it looks, if you go down here, it looks as if that's some kind of conservatory area. Do you think that might be? It's hard to tell. It's such a big house.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't look like an outdoor part. It looks like you're going into another room because of the lighting on it, isn't it?
Yeah. And here, all very nice. But that's all we've got.
Gosh.
Of evidence of that, of Mr. Birt's sort of creation. So what they did, of course, it's demolished. They demolished most of it, nearly all of it, in 1930. It became a golf club in 1936. During World War II, it was ploughed to produce cereal crops, and the clubhouse became an officer's mess. So the only bit that's left. So here we've got the castle, okay?
Yeah.
Here we've got the stables. The stables are still there. All that's left is this.
Oh, right.
Sort of the East Pavilion.
The pavilion.
Yeah, just that, as you can see.
Oh, yes.
They've added this bit on, obviously, for a slightly bigger clubhouse, but there we are. That's all that's left of Wenvoe Castle.
Well. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's all that's left. That one little bit in the middle. Good enough.
And the stables, which were probably probably by Henry Holland. They're a different design. The stables are there, and isn't it amazing? I mean, that vast castle, and they didn't knock it all down. They must have known they wanted a clubhouse.
Yeah.
Maybe. But what, they just left this little bit. Well, and that's Wenvoe Castle. I've got to say, though, whenever I think of Wenvoe, I didn't think of Wenvoe Castle. I thought of the Wenvoe Tunnel. You know the Wenvoe Tunnel? An old railway tunnel. I love what's underneath us, you see. And it goes underneath Culverhouse Cross today.
Oh, right.
It was built in 1888. Opened, I think, in 1889. It runs for 1 mile. And it goes, and it was closed, I think, in the 1960s, and it's just left.
Yeah.
And I love that, the whole Subterranea Britannica thing, what's underneath our feet. So just purely personal indulgence.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
If you walk it, which of course it is all, but people have walked it because that's what they do. It runs for 1 mile, which, put it into perspective, is the length of the Mall in London times 2. If you walk in it, that's what you walk down the Mall, you walk back again. And I love it. This is the main water line now.
Right.
And you've got the little pinprick.
Pinprick of light in the distance as you're heading towards it, yeah.
Looks like Chernobyl.
Oh, yeah.
It's actually the rust over years
Yeah.
as you go through. And there is an air vent sort of halfway down, which I think comes up in what used to be PC World now.
Oh, right.
But it's very dramatic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yes, I do like the idea of tunnels and things like that.
Yeah.
So that was a little look at Wenvoe Castle and Machen House. Sort of get back into it, really.
Yeah. They're interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
And we will have to have a little look at, again, werewolves and witches and local folklore. Because like I said, there should be more, but in all the houses we've talked about, we haven't had that many witch stories, have we, linked to the property?
That is intriguing. That is interesting. But particularly as an area which is this can sound controversial, particularly an area which is very Catholic, particularly in our parts of the world, because an awful lot post the unpleasantness with Henry VIII and the Reformation and things like this, an awful lot of practices that had simply been good Catholic practices, such as the wearing of Christian amulets and this, that, and the other, so it became classified as witchcraft.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were just following things from the old religion, will now suddenly find themselves accused of witchery. Now that is something which doesn't seem to happen, even though we know that there was quite a lot of Catholic presence and a lot of Catholic persecution in the area, particularly around Llangibby, as we talked around Llangibby. So that's interesting, isn't it? That the witch stories don't really crop up very much.
It's interesting you mentioned St. Bridget, because at Tredegar House, when they turn the servants' bedrooms in the attics, the dormer windows, into dormitories for the Catholic school, they used to have, if you remember, Goff, the nameplates of what the borders, and St. Bridget was one of them.
Oh, there you are.
So St. Bridget had a dormitory at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Convent at Tredegar House named after her.
Yeah.
So there we are. Well, I think we can put the tin hat on that one now, I think. So now, if anyone has any bits on Wenvoe Castle, if you have any photographs at all, do let us know. And if you buy Machen House, do invite us round for a cup of tea.
Yes, we'd love to pop in.
That would be nice too.
We can show you where the Reverend Augustus died horribly.
After dinner entertainment, you can rely on Busby and Morgan. Book us now, but you'll probably only book us once. Thanks, Goff. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.